June 6, 1944, 4 in the afternoon. In a room at the Berghof, Adolf Hitler finally authorized the movement of Germany's panzer reserves toward Normandy. 9.5 hours after the invasion began. 9.5 hours after the first Allied soldiers set foot on French soil. The order came as a single typed sentence on official Wehrmacht letterhead, transmitted by secure telephone line to Paris, then to field commanders across northern France. By the time German tanks began moving, over 130,000 Allied troops had already landed. The beachheads, 5 separate landing zones stretching along 50 miles of Norman coast, had merged into a single continuous front. What should have been Germany's counterattack had become a belated response. What should have been a battle to throw invaders back into the sea had become a desperate attempt to contain an army already digging into French soil. But the real story wasn't the delay itself. It was what Hitler said, and refused to say, during those 9 hours. His words that morning, spoken to increasingly desperate staff officers, revealed a mind detaching from reality at the precise moment reality demanded absolute clarity. This is the story of those hours, of the decisions unmade and the orders never given, and of how a single man's certainty destroyed Germany's last chance to stop the liberation of Europe. The calls started at dawn. Not to the Berghof, Hitler was still sleeping, but to Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin and Paris. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander of German forces in the West, received the first confirmed reports at 6:45. Parachutists inland. Naval bombardment beginning. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't reconnaissance. The invasion had begun. Von Rundstedt did what military protocol demanded. He ordered immediate local counterattacks with forces under his direct command. Then he requested authorization to move the strategic reserves, the panzer divisions held back specifically for this moment, toward the invasion beaches. Those divisions belonged to OKW, the High Command. They answered directly to Hitler. Only the Führer could release them. The response came back within 20 minutes. Request denied. The Führer is sleeping. Wait for his personal authorization. Von Rundstedt stood at the window of his Paris headquarters, looking out at a city still dark, still quiet, still occupied. 70 years old, a Prussian officer of the old school, he'd commanded armies before Hitler came to power. He understood what was happening in Normandy with a clarity born from decades of military experience. The Allies were landing in force. The next 6 hours would determine whether Germany could stop them. Every minute without armor moving toward the coast was a minute the enemy used to dig in deeper, but without Hitler's authorization, the panzers couldn't move. So von Rundstedt waited and called again at 7:30, and was told again, the Führer is sleeping. 300 miles west on the Norman coast, German soldiers were fighting without the support they'd been promised. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt commanded the 6th Parachute Regiment near Sainte-Mère-Église. American paratroopers had dropped during the night, scattered, disorganized, but dropping in such numbers that by dawn the regiment was fighting on 3 sides at once. Von der Heydt had been told the invasion, when it came, would be met with immediate armored counterattack. The battle plan was clear. Local forces delay the enemy at the beaches, while panzer divisions race forward to crush them before they can establish supply lines. Everything depended on speed. Everything depended on armor arriving within hours, not days. At 8 that morning, von der Heydt's radio operator received confirmation. Allied forces landing on multiple beaches. Naval bombardment heavy. Airborne assault widespread. The message ended with a line that made von der Heydt's stomach tighten. Panzer reserves not yet authorized for deployment. He turned to his second-in-command. They're not releasing the panzers. Why not? I don't know. By 9, the scale of the invasion was undeniable. Reports flooded into Wehrmacht headquarters. 5 separate beach landings, thousands of ships, naval gunfire destroying coastal defenses, Allied aircraft dominating the skies. The poor weather that German meteorologists had predicted would prevent any invasion attempt had clearly not stopped the Allies. They'd come anyway, and they were coming in overwhelming force. General Blumentritt, von Rundstedt's chief of staff, made another call to Berchtesgaden, more urgent this time. The invasion was massive. This wasn't a feint. They needed the panzer divisions now, immediately, or the opportunity to stop the Allies at the waterline would disappear. The answer came from Colonel General Alfred Jodl, speaking carefully, his voice carrying the tension of a man navigating impossible protocols. The Führer has not yet been briefed on the situation. When he wakes and receives the reports, he will make his decision. Until then, no authorization. When will he wake? When he wakes. Blumentritt hung up. He looked at von Rundstedt. Both men understood what was happening. Not just a military failure. They'd seen those before. But something stranger, something that violated every principle of command they'd been taught. An invasion was occurring, and the Supreme Commander was asleep. Not wounded, not incapacitated, not dealing with another crisis. Asleep. No one would wake him. Hitler emerged from his bedroom at 10:15. He'd slept 9 hours, undisturbed by the invasion transforming the war. By the time he dressed and walked to the map room, Allied troops controlled substantial sections of Norman coastline. The beach code-named Omaha had nearly been lost to American forces. Brutal German resistance from the cliffs had turned the sand red with blood, but the Americans kept coming, kept dying, kept pushing forward until they broke through. At Gold Beach, British troops were moving inland. At Juno, Canadians had pierced the Atlantic Wall. At Sword, British forces were pushing toward Caen. Jodl briefed him with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed every word. Allied landings in Normandy. 5 beaches. Airborne forces inland. Naval superiority absolute. Weather poor, but clearly insufficient to stop them. Local commanders requesting immediate release of panzer reserves to counterattack before the beachhead becomes unbreakable. Hitler listened. His face showed no alarm, no urgency, no recognition that decisions made in the next hours would shape the outcome of the war. Instead, he smiled. A small, satisfied smile that made Jodl's blood run cold. "This is what I predicted," Hitler said. "Normandy, not Calais. I told them the invasion would come in Normandy, and here it is. The generals doubted me. The intelligence reports said Calais, but I knew better." He walked to the large map table, his finger tracing the Norman coast. "This is their deception, a large-scale raid designed to pull our reserves south, away from Calais. Then, when we've committed our forces to Normandy, they launch the real invasion across the narrowest part of the channel. It's exactly what I would do in their position." Jodl felt the moment slipping away. He'd known Hitler for years, understood how the man's mind worked, the unshakable certainties, the intuitions he trusted more than intelligence reports, the pattern of being right just often enough to reinforce his belief in his own infallibility. But this wasn't a moment for intuition. This was a moment for immediate, decisive action. "Mein Führer," Jodl said carefully. "The size of the operation suggests this is the main invasion. 5 beaches, airborne divisions, over 1,000 ships. This level of commitment is exactly what makes it believable." Hitler interrupted. "That's the point of deception. Make the feint look real. Make us commit our reserves to the wrong location. Then strike where we're weak." He tapped the map at Calais. "This is where they'll come. The real invasion. We hold our panzers in reserve. We don't fall for their trick." Field Marshal Keitel, who'd entered the room during the briefing, nodded agreement. "The Führer's strategic instinct has proven correct repeatedly. We should trust it now." Others in the room remained silent. Not because they agreed, but because they'd learned what happened to officers who argued too forcefully with Hitler. Careers ended, positions lost, in extreme cases, worse. So they stood around the map table, looking at the red markers indicating Allied positions spreading across Normandy like blood in water, and said nothing. By 11:30, von Rundstedt called again from Paris. His voice carried barely controlled frustration. Allied forces were consolidating, engineers clearing beach obstacles, tanks beginning to land. Without immediate armored counterattack, the invasion would succeed. Not might succeed, would succeed. They needed authorization now. Hitler's response, relayed through Jodl, was unchanged. Hold the panzer reserves in position, wait for the real invasion at Calais. Von Rundstedt hung up and turned to his staff. For a moment, he said nothing, then quietly, almost to himself, "This is madness." Across northern France, German commanders made decisions within the narrow authority they possessed. Artillery fired at landing craft. Machine gun nests held their positions until overrun. Infantry counterattacked where they could, died where they couldn't. Some units fought with extraordinary courage. The 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach inflicted terrible casualties, nearly throwing the Americans back into the sea. But courage without armor couldn't stop an invasion. It could only delay it. Major Hans von Luck commanded a regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, positioned 15 miles from Sword Beach. His tanks sat ready, crews at their stations, engines idling. They could reach the coast in an hour, maybe less. Every instinct von Luck possessed screamed at him to move, orders or not. But he'd been a soldier too long to disobey direct commands from the High Command. At noon, he received permission for limited reconnaissance, not an attack, not a counterattack, reconnaissance. He moved a small force forward and immediately encountered British paratroopers who'd landed inland during the night. A brief, sharp engagement. His tanks had the advantage. Better armor, better guns. The paratroopers scattered. But this wasn't reconnaissance. This was a glimpse of what his entire division could have accomplished if unleashed at dawn. Von Luck later wrote, "We could hear the naval bombardment all morning. We knew what was happening. We knew what needed to be done. But we had our orders. Wait." So we waited, and listened to the guns, and watched the clock, and felt the opportunity slipping away with every passing hour. At the Berghof, Hitler spent the afternoon reviewing reports and explaining repeatedly why Normandy was a feint. He spoke with absolute conviction. No doubt, no hesitation. The certainty in his voice never wavered. Aides who'd hoped the accumulating evidence might change his mind found instead that each new report of Allied landings only reinforced his belief in the deception. By 2, Allied forces had pushed inland to depths of up to 5 miles in some sectors. The beachhead was no longer fragile. It was consolidating into a fortified position. Engineers had cleared 16 lanes through beach obstacles. Tanks and artillery were coming ashore in steady streams. Supply dumps were being established. What had been an invasion that morning was becoming an occupation by afternoon. General Dolman, commander of the 7th Army responsible for defending Normandy, made one final plea to headquarters. His voice, recorded in Wehrmacht communication logs, carried the flat tone of a man who'd stopped hoping and started documenting. Without immediate armored counterattack, we cannot prevent the enemy from establishing a permanent beachhead. Local reserves are insufficient. We need the panzer divisions. We need them now. In 6 hours, it may be too late. In 12 hours, it will certainly be too late. The response from Berchtesgaden: hold position. The Führer will authorize movement when the situation clarifies. At 4 in the afternoon, 9.5 hours after the invasion began, Hitler finally authorized partial release of the panzer reserves. Not both divisions racing full speed toward the beaches with orders to drive the Allies into the sea. A measured, cautious deployment. The 12th SS Panzer Division could move toward Caen, slowly, carefully, maintaining readiness to redeploy north if the real invasion came at Calais. The order reached field commanders as evening approached. By then, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. The moment for counterattack, that narrow, desperate window that existed only in the first hours of invasion, had closed. What could have been a battle to throw the invaders back had become a grinding campaign to contain an army that was already dug in, supplied, and reinforced. Major General Edgar Feuchtinger, who'd spent the day watching his 21st Panzer Division sit motionless while the invasion succeeded, received authorization to move at dusk. Too late to reach the beaches before dark. Too late to catch the Allies while they were vulnerable. He advanced anyway, because orders were orders, and ran straight into British forces that had spent the day fortifying their positions. The counterattack stalled. His tanks, which could have been devastating that morning, were merely dangerous that evening. By midnight on June 6th, the strategic situation was clear to everyone except Hitler. The Allies had established an unbreakable foothold in France. 5 beachheads, over 156,000 troops ashore. Casualties on both sides were heavy. The Allies suffered nearly 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing. German losses were harder to calculate, but substantial. But the fundamental reality was undeniable. The invasion had succeeded. No second invasion came at Calais. Not that day, not that week, not ever. The massive force that Hitler had been so certain was coming, the real invasion that Normandy was supposedly designed to distract from, existed only in his mind. The Allies had put everything into Normandy because Normandy was the plan, the only plan. And Hitler's absolute certainty that he understood their strategy better than they did had cost Germany the one chance to stop them. In the days that followed, German forces fought with skill and determination. They made the Allies pay for every mile, every village, every hedgerow in the Norman bocage. The battle for France would drag on for months. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The foothold established on June 6th would become a flood. By August, the Allies would break out of Normandy. By September, Paris would be liberated. By May 1945, Germany would surrender. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, asked after the war what he remembered about D-Day, paused before answering. I remember the telephone calls, hour after hour, calling headquarters, requesting authorization to move the panzers, being told to wait, being told the Führer knew best. I'd commanded armies for 40 years. I knew what was happening in Normandy, but knowledge didn't matter. Only his certainty mattered, and his certainty was wrong. Rommel, who'd raced back to France that afternoon and spent the evening surveying the disaster, wrote to his wife 2 days later. The letter, found among his personal papers after his forced suicide in October 1944, contained a single devastating assessment. The war is lost. We lost it on the morning of June 6th, in the 9 hours when we could have stopped them but chose not to move. Everything since then has been aftermath. Hitler never acknowledged the mistake. In the weeks and months that followed, as the Allies expanded their beachhead and German forces retreated, he blamed the weather, the naval bombardment, the commanders who failed to fight hard enough, the troops who lacked sufficient will. But never the decision to hold back the panzers. Never the 9 hours of certainty while reality was happening without his permission. Colonel General Jodl, who stood outside Hitler's bedroom door that morning deciding whether to knock, later testified at the Nuremberg trials. Asked about D-Day, about the delay in releasing the reserves, he gave an answer that captured something essential about how Germany had been commanded in those final years of the war. The Führer believed he possessed intuitive understanding of the enemy's intentions that transcended intelligence reports or tactical analysis. Sometimes he was right, often enough to reinforce his faith in his intuition. But on June 6, 1944, he was catastrophically wrong. And because no one could convince him otherwise, because his certainty overruled everyone else's knowledge, we lost the one chance we had to throw the Allies back into the sea. We didn't lose because we lacked the forces. We lost because we lacked the will to use them when it mattered most. An elderly veteran of the 21st Panzer Division, interviewed in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, remembered that morning with a clarity undimmed by 50 years. We sat in our tanks, ready, waiting, listening to the naval guns, knowing Allied troops were landing, knowing we could stop them if we moved immediately. And we waited, hour after hour. By afternoon, when they finally let us move, it was over. We'd lost. Not because they beat us in battle. We fought hard when we finally engaged them. We lost because someone decided it was more important to be right about his prediction than to respond to what was actually happening. I'm 90 years old now. I've had a lifetime to think about that morning, and I still can't understand how we sat there, capable and ready, and did nothing while the war slipped away. The guns that fired at dawn on June 6, 1944, announced the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. But the silence that morning at the Berghof, the hours when no orders came, when certainty replaced judgment, when ideology trumped reality, that silence announced something that would echo far beyond World War II. It revealed how empires fall not always in dramatic defeats, but in quiet rooms where leaders choose comfortable delusions over uncomfortable truths, where the need to be right becomes more important than the need to be effective, where 9 hours of certainty costs everything. The Allied troops who landed that morning on 5 Norman beaches didn't know they'd already won before the first shot was fired. They fought as if everything depended on their courage, their skill, their willingness to run into machine gun fire because the cause demanded it. And it did depend on those things, but it also depended on something they couldn't have known. That while they were fighting for their lives on blood-soaked sand, the man who commanded the only force that could stop them was asleep. And when he finally woke, his certainty about what the enemy would do was so unshakable that reality itself couldn't penetrate it. History doesn't always turn on battles. Sometimes it turns on silence, on decisions unmade, on certainty that cannot admit doubt, on 9 hours when the world changed while one man slept and then woke and chose to believe what he wanted to believe rather than what was actually happening. That's what Hitler said the moment D-Day succeeded. Nothing. For 9.5 hours, he said nothing. And by the time he finally spoke, there was nothing left to say that could change what had already been lost.